here now to introduce Andre and Marianne Robbie, who we got to know last year about this time. Very briefly, over 28 years ago, Marianne and Andre, while doing missionary work in Southern Africa, as teenagers, met. And as they put it, fell hopelessly in love. And here they are today, 28 years later. In the last 18 years especially have been traveling the world several times a year to meet with folk who want to know more about being always loved, the message that they bring from South Africa. They've produced 2 children who are now both married, boy and a girl, written 5 books, produced 3 music albums. Marianne is the primary talent in that regard, Andre tells me. And they're nearing the end of the tour, Debbie mentioned. They are going back to South Africa on Wednesday, so they've saved the best for last. They're here with us. And I have to say that their website, there we go. No? There it is. That's their logo. Their website is always loved. And that's a message that Andre and Marianne have been singing, preaching for the last 28 years. So I invite you to join me in welcoming them here today, and Andre to come up and give us a message on this loving one another. Andre.
Good morning. Well, thank you. Is this working? You can hear me? Such a joy to be with you, and what an amazing subject. And I so love that song. That was actually one of the verses that we're going to be looking at in 1 John 4, verse 7. So, talking about love, now sometimes we don't just want to talk about it. Love is one of those things you want to experience. But there is so much to be said. But hopefully what is said will point us back to the actual experience of it. We've had the privilege of talking to people in every type of circumstance, whether it's your most people in the most desperate poverty situations, or people of great privilege and wealth. And no matter where you find yourself, if you do not have an opportunity to love, or you do not know that you are loved, you are tormented. And in the same breath, no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, if you come to that place where you know that you are loved, life is transformed. Life becomes a feast. And one of the first verses that came to mind was John 13, where Jesus says, love one another, in the same way that I loved you. So I want to quickly just focus on that idea. How does Jesus love us? Because Jesus takes this whole subject beyond theory, and he actually demonstrates what it means to love. That reminds me of, John 1, verse 1. In the beginning was the Word was with God. That little word we've translated word. It's where we get our word logic from. But it means more than logic. It speaks about both the underlying logic and the expression of that logic. So John is trying to say, what is the underlying logic and fabric of reality? This idea that was right from the beginning, that was with God, that was God. What gives life meaning? Why are we here? And in verse 10, he says, this word has always been in the world, but we have not recognized it. And then in verse 14, he says, but this word, this idea, this thought became flesh. In other words, this logic, the logic of God's love, is not something that just remained in a theoretical, abstract imagination arena, but it is a thought that actually becomes flesh. That is, I think, the heart of Christianity, is this idea that God is not aloof, God is not somewhere else, but God actually descended into our humanity in the person of Jesus. So in Jesus, we do not meet a God that just comes and demands that you should be a little bit more spiritual. In Jesus, we don't meet a God that says you need to ascend into a greater level of spirituality. But in Jesus, we meet a God who descends into our humanity. A God who demonstrates the closeness, the tangibility of God's love. That's why when Jesus introduces us to God, he says, he is Emmanuel, God with us. Not the God of our imagination that's somewhere else, that kind of watches us from a distance, but the God who stepped into our chaos, the God who steps into our existence, the God who comes to demonstrate that he understands us and knows us on our level. And you know, in 1 John 1 verse 1, he takes that same thought further and he says, that which was from the beginning, the very heart, the very source of all existence, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen, and which our hands have handled. Again, Jesus is modeling a type of love that takes it beyond theory and brings it back into a tangible reality. Now, let's for a moment make it practical. I so love the fact that we could actually do a few actions. It's such a simple song that, you know, the love of God. And very often it's those very simple, practical messages that we go away with. And so a few of the things that starts becoming clear in the way in which God demonstrated his love for us in the person of Jesus, in this act in which God becomes humans, demonstrates how entangled he is in our flesh. One of the things that for me is something that took years to realize, but I'm starting to realize it more and more, is God isn't somewhere else demanding our love, demanding our adoration, but rather part of the way in which God demonstrates his love is in this act where he says, I'm entangled with your life. I'm entangled with your story. I'm part of your flesh. I'm part of this story. And practically what that means to me is the way in which we demonstrate our love to one another. You know, I guess in a selfish way, we also just want people to just love us where we are, what we're doing. But part of the way in which we demonstrate our love is to entangle ourselves in the stories of others, is to become part of their lives and allow them to become part of our lives beyond what we are maybe comfortable with. Does that make sense? So that means that throughout my life, I've been surprised often the extent to which Mary Ann will show interest in what I'm doing, even if it wasn't really of interest to her. Sometimes she might even see a movie that she's really not interested in, but because I would like to see it. And for a long time, I really resisted watching anything that's a musical. That just didn't interest me at all. And then one day, she said, well, come watch Les Miserables with me. And that was the first musical I see. And I hate to admit it, but by the end I was in tears, and I loved it. It was amazing. And so that is a silly illustration that love is starting to draw us beyond what we're comfortable with, beyond who we thought we are, get us involved in interests and things that we thought we weren't interested in. Isn't that the story of Adam and Eve? Adam is so centered. He's so self-assured in a way. He has just demonstrated the incredible capacity of his consciousness to give meaning to everything around him. He named all the animals. But then something happens in a dreamlike state. Isha is drawn out of Ish. That's the two Hebrew names. Ish means the male and Isha, the female. And it's beautiful. The actual word Isha means out of man. It's almost like relationship is what draws you out of yourself. And in this dreamlike state, as he beholds Eve, he says, this is Isha, and she shall be named. It's almost like he can't even name her then, because the experience has decentered him. The experience is overwhelming, and instead of the control and power over language that was on display just before, he can't even name her. And in fact, she is only named after the incident of eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's when he says, your name shall be Eve. But that's just that little insight, that relationship, love, is supposed to draw you out of yourself. Love is not supposed to just be a feeling, an experience, a thought, an idea that leaves you the way it found you. Love transforms you. And that's why we are often a little bit nervous about it, aren't we? Because that means I need to become a bit more vulnerable. I need to allow myself to be exposed. And vulnerability is a bit scary, because if I'm vulnerable, it means I can be hurt. And that's true, but you can also not be intimate without vulnerability. They go together. And so the way in which God demonstrates his love to us is not by remaining aloof, but by stepping into our story, stepping into our chaos, becoming part of our world, and demonstrating his love right there in the middle of our existence. Now that's very different from the way in which people have imagined God. Even in the time of Jesus, there were ideas of a God. The gods were distant. The gods existed in a state which they called ataraxia. It was like the Greek word was a place of total tranquility. And for them, this place of total peace or tranquility meant the absence of all problems and pains. And that's why you read the beautiful poems of the gods who sits on the clouds and they can watch a baby being born or someone being murdered, a wedding or a war, and they're unmoved. Because if they allowed themselves to be moved, they would lose their peace. Well, Jesus reveals a God whose peace has such integrity that he doesn't have to avoid you to remain in peace. But a God who steps right into the middle of your confusion and your conflict and brings his peace there. The God who becomes flesh. And so, again, there's a beautiful verse that we sang, 1 John 4, verse 7. To love another is to know God. In other words, even our knowledge of God is not something that's simply done theoretically. Now, I'm going on a lot about the theory. I love studying this. There's a part which says, love the Lord with all your mind. There's a part of loving that involves your intellect. But do you understand that this love ultimately finds expression in an act of loving another? In other words, to know God is only something that can be done in the act of loving another. Loving God, knowing God is not something I just do in my imagination. Knowing God is not something I just do in my belief system. Knowing God is not something I do on my own only. But knowing God, the most profound way. And next week I know that you're going to look at that beautiful idea of even loving enemies. But loving God, knowing God ultimately comes down to an act in which I love another. And that unfolds who he is and who we are. So, I kind of wanted to give a few practical points. And number one, I'm going to run over it because I think I only have 3 minutes to just give you those ideas. 5 minutes, okay. So, so a few practical ideas. Jesus, being the manifestation of God amongst us, reveals a God to us that doesn't stay aloof and just demands our love, but a God who steps into our world, a God who shows interest, real interest in who we are. In fact, it's Philippians 2, verse 7. It was one of the slides, maybe we'll find, there we go, from 5 to 7. It says that he empties himself into our existence, becoming a man. Can you see how the story of Jesus completely reverses the story of Genesis 3? In Genesis 3, we've got a humanity with such a sense of lack that they try to grasp after every fruit that will give them more being, every fruit that promises to make them more like God. But in Jesus, we meet a God who says, your life is of such interest and beauty to me that I empty myself out into human existence. So instead of the human story that says we must become more like God, God says, I want to be more involved in your life, in your story right here. Wasn't that the most essential message of Jesus? Change your way of thinking. The kingdom of God is here. My story, my plan, my idea is unfolding right here, right now. So practically it means love is not just something people do to you. Love is the act in which you show genuine interest and become involved in the lives of others. Does that make sense? It's that act that says, I'm going to step out of my comfort zone, step out of what I'm just naturally interested in, step out of what I'm familiar with, and entangle myself in your life. And this is not a patronizing interest. This is a genuinely real interest in, I want to see the way you see things. Have you ever walked through an art gallery and maybe you didn't have much interest in the paintings, but there's somebody there that's just passionate, a friend or a partner that just loves, and they start telling you the meaning and the technique and the history of the painting, and you begin to see the art through their eyes, and suddenly the beauty unfolds. That is what happens when we genuinely involve ourselves and show interest in the lives of others. A new world of meaning and beauty unfolds. The second point I'm summarizing. Jesus demonstrates a God who is present. You know, one of the most valuable things that you can give another person is your presence. Have you ever been with somebody that's not really there? Okay. They're somewhere in the past. They're somewhere in the future. They're somewhere inside, but they're not there. Jesus demonstrates a God who is present, God with us. He demonstrates what love is like. That there are times that we might, in our routine, get so used to having breakfast or having coffee with the same person. But maybe once in a while, just bring yourself back to that realization that, wow, here I am. I can give you my full attention. I can give you my full presence. I don't have to be busy with the rest of the day or with yesterday. I can just be wowed with this moment. God is, I am, present. So that's the second thought of how we love. The third thought was that vulnerability, the fact that God takes on the frailty of human flesh and He allows us to do with Him whatever we please, and we know what we did to Him. But love doesn't just live in reaction. Love doesn't just defend itself. Love is patient. Love gives itself, even to the point where it might be painful at times. And then the last point I want to make, also demonstrated by the incarnation, is love takes initiative. There's a beautiful verse in 1 John as well that says, we love because He first loved us. God has taken the initiative. And now the love of God has been poured into our hearts so that we can love one another even as He loved us. And that means love doesn't wait for another person to demonstrate their love to me. Love takes the initiative. Love says, what can I do to give myself to another. Obviously, ultimately, we want love to be this beautiful flow and this exchange. But it begins somewhere. This is such a huge topic that we can spend the whole day talking about it. But I hope that there was some little bits out of that you can take and say, hey, let me try something I haven't tried before. Let me go watch a musical. let me, show interest and involve yourself in somebody else's life and see what meaning and beauty awaits you. Papa, we thank you for demonstrating your love towards us, in giving yourself and involving yourself in our stories. In the midst of the chaos and the confusion, you bring your peace. Thank you, Papa. We thank you that this love that you have poured into our hearts can now overflow, become a fountain of living water, and bring healing to our families, to our communities, to our nations. Thank you, Abba. Amen. Amen.